In New York City during the early 20th century, factories with horrible conditions employed many immigrants who came to America in search of a better life. Barely speaking any English, these workers would take any job they could and make measly wages. The owners of these factories were greedy, despicable men who would exploit their workers and do whatever it took to make themselves richer.
On March 25, 1911, a small fire in the rag bin of a factory called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory would lead to some massive casualties. The fire could have been stopped right away. A manager who spotted the fire took action and grabbed a fire extinguisher to put out the fire, but was unable to because the hose of the extinguisher had rusted. The fire spread incredibly fast, only burning for a total of 18 minutes.
The workers, many of whom were teenage immigrant girls who spoke little to no English, tried to escape the building any way they could, but it was nearly impossible due to poor safety features of the building. The building had no fire sprinklers, one functioning elevator out of the 4 that were in the factory. To make matters worse, that elevator would break down after just 4 trips during the fire. The only other choice they had was to go down the stairwell and exit through the door, but to their surprise, the door was locked. Trapped in with nowhere to go, some workers even decided to jump down the elevator shaft to try and escape the flames, while others chose to jump out of the burning building to their deaths.
Owners of the factory, Max Blanc and Isaac Harris, known as the Shirtwaist Kings, were greedy, negligent bosses who cared little about the environment in which the girls in the factory were working. The immigrant workers worked in very tight spaces with sewing machines all around them. The reason why there was no sprinklers in the first place was because they wanted to be able to burn down the factory to capitalize on large fire insurance policies in the future. They cared little for their workers and would force them to work 12-hour days, 6 days a week in terrible working conditions. The door to get out of the 9th floor would even be locked to make sure nobody left, having no regards to whether or not workers needed to get out in case of an emergency. The 2 owners would eventually be indicted for manslaughter, but were found not guilty by a grand jury. They would later have to pay $75 per life after losing a civil suit. These 2 were major reasons why the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire would be such a disaster.
Although the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was a complete catastrophe, there was many positive safety reforms that resulted from it. The incident led to many to call for immediate improvements to working conditions throughout the city of New York and the nation as a whole. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union also chipped in by organizing relief efforts for the victims' families. This help included payments to survivors and placement of orphans, while also demanding reform. Previous strikes, such as the uprising of the 20,000, may have led to improved conditions for factories, but the aftermath of the Triangle Shirtwaist fire would lead to legislation on both state and national levels. The city of New York created the Bureau of Fire Prevention as a result of this disaster. The Bureau implemented many safety and compensation laws, along with enforcing building and fire codes to ensure that nothing like this would ever happen again.
In addition to the creation of the Bureau, the Sullivan-Hoey Fire Prevention Law was passed in October of that year. This law required that sprinkler systems be installed in all New York City factories. Also, the Factory Commission of 1911, headed by Samuel Gompers, recommended that legislation be passed to require exit doors to open outward and to be unlocked at all times. This legislation would become the foundation of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Not only were laws passed, but the New York Democratic set took up the cause of the worker. The terrible disaster that is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire would be a key to spark the realization that a safe working environment was essential for workers.
Until the events of September 11th, it was the deadliest workplace disaster in New York City history. Days later, on April 5th, a massive funeral protest march took place on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. More than 350,000 people were in attendance. The factory owners, Max Blanc and Isaac Harris, were indicted for manslaughter, but were declared not guilty in their trial later that year. Yet, Long after the flames died out, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire served as a cautionary tale that helped to redefine the American industrial workplace.